All right, so we're diving deep today into some recent Michael Irvin commentary. You sent this YouTube video over to me.
Yep.
And you really wanted to kind of get like the core of like what he's seeing as far as the Cowboys offseason moves and maybe what their strategy should be going forward.
Right. We wanted to cut through the noise and really hone in on what he was emphasizing.
Right. Absolutely. And I think he covers a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
We've got his like core philosophy on how to win championships.
Yeah.
He has some opinions on what the Cowboys need at running back and receiver.
Of course.
He definitely had some thoughts on Cooper Kupp ending up in Seattle.
Yeah, and that's gonna be really interesting.
And then a kind of out of left field comment on on drafting Shedeur Sanders.
Right. That was surprising.
Yeah. So I think this is going to be interesting.
Oh, let's dive in.
And I think one of the things that he starts off with here is just this very firm belief that points win championships.
Right.
And he really challenges this kind of age-old, adage that defense wins championships.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like a direct, pushback against that whole notion.
Absolutely. And I've heard him say this before, and I think it's interesting because he says, your defense can play lights out for, 58 minutes.
Right.
But if they let up one score and you don't score,
you lose.
You lose.
Yeah.
So it's really about, maximizing that offensive potential, especially if you've got a good quarterback and, two receivers that can really.
Right. And I think we're seeing more of that in the NFL today. Right. You've got to have that offensive firepower.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, historically, it's been that you need a good defense to be successful.
Sure.
So it'll be interesting to see, kind of how they balance that out.
Well, and he even uses the Bengals Super Bowl appearance a few years back as an example.
Yeah.
And he said, they had, I think he said the worst offensive line to ever make it to a Super Bowl.
Wow.
But they had, the playmakers on offense.
Right.
And so, I think it kind of brings up this point that, maybe you don't need this absolutely dominant offensive line that everyone's looking for.
Sure.
Maybe you just need, competent play as long as your quarterback's decisive and your receivers can get open.
Right. If you got guys that can, make plays happen.
Yeah. And this kind of leads into his what he calls the rule of three for offensive linemen.
Yeah. I like that, the rule of three.
So talk to me about that a little bit. What is the rule of three?
So essentially he's telling these, younger offensive linemen that if you can stay in front of a defender for 3 seconds, you're going to make a lot of money in the NFL.
Okay.
That's all you need.
3 seconds.
3 seconds.
Stay in front of your guy for 3 seconds.
Yep, that's all you got to do. Okay.
And you're going to make bank.
All right. I like it. The rule of three. I'm going to start using that. There you go. So, keeping in mind this philosophy that he's got offensively, what were his initial thoughts on what the Cowboys have done this offseason?
So he mentions that, the Cowboys have been doing a lot on defense, bringing new guys in.
Okay.
And then also that they've, acquired 2 running backs, through free agency.
Yeah.
But then he says that, they still have work to do. So it's interesting that, he notes that those moves were made,
right,
but immediately shifts to, they still need that, difference maker at running back and another receiver that really kind of like underscores what his priorities are.
Right.
For, what the Cowboys need.
Well, and one of those needs is this difference maker at running back.
Yeah.
And he specifically mentions hoping that Genty is available.
Right.
And I think based on his later discussion referencing him alongside Matthew Golden.
Right. I'm pretty sure he's talking about Ashton Dublin.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds like.
And he, kind of talks about the impact that a player like that can have. And he even compares it to when Emmitt Smith came to the Cowboys.
Right.
And saying that, a really impactful running back can elevate the entire offense, even the offensive line.
Yeah. I think he's right. He points to guys like Saquon Barkley,
right,
Derrick Henry,
right,
what they're able to do for their teams.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's huge.
And he also really emphasizes the need for another receiver to play alongside CeeDee Lamb.
Of course.
And again, he kind of draws this parallel to the Bengals and how they've ensured that, their top receiver has some help.
Right, giving some support.
And he highlights the fact that, the Cowboys have had a top offense for several years now.
Yeah.
They've won 12 games for 3 seasons in a row.
Right.
And so he's really a believer in building that that potent offense and making sure that CeeDee Lamb has the talent around him.
Right. You got to have the weapons
Yeah.
to make it work.
Absolutely.
Right.
Now this leads us to Cooper Kupp.
Yeah.
And he clearly felt like the Cowboys missed an opportunity there.
Yeah.
But he also seemed pretty optimistic about him joining the Seahawks.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's interesting how he talks about why he thinks it's going to be a good fit for Kupp.
Yeah.
He mentions the new offensive coordinator,
Right.
Ryan Grubb,
Right.
and also that, Sam Darnold is there.
Yeah.
So, it seems like they're maybe going to be shifting their offense a little bit.
Sure.
And I think he envisions Kupp as being kind of that ideal inside guy for them,
Right.
Thriving in that slot position.
And he also sees his arrival as potentially being very beneficial for Jackson Smith and Jigba.
Right.
Even though JSN, had a lot of slot yardage previously.
Right. But Irvin's, point there is that Kupp can really be a mentor to him in this new offensive system.
Right.
And, learn from one of the best slot receivers in the league.
Right.
And I think it's interesting, too, that he mentions that he actually predicted Kupp would end up in Seattle.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So he's been following this situation closely.
Okay.
And really understands, the potential synergy there.
Interesting. So now he does bring up a concern regarding CeeDee Lamb.
Yeah.
And it's not about his talent.
Right.
It's about his attitude and his connection with the quarterback.
Yeah, and this is interesting because he specifically references a playoff game.
Okay.
Against Green Bay a couple of years ago.
Right.
And there was a missed connection early on in the game.
Okay.
And then he kind of sensed that, the communication just wasn't there the rest of the game.
Interesting.
And it really kind of stuck with him.
It sounds like his concern is really that, Lamb's a playmaker,
Right.
but for the offense to truly be what it can be,
right,
you've got to have that connection. You've got to have that understanding with the quarterback.
Absolutely. I mean, especially in those high-pressure playoff situations.
Right.
You got to be on the same page.
Absolutely. So I mean, it sounds like, the talent is there,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
but maybe some of the intangible...
Right, chemistry, the communication.
Right.
That's what's missing.
Interesting. Okay, so going back to the receiver discussion.
Okay.
There's this hypothetical scenario that he brings up.
Yep.
Where, the Cowboys have the option to acquire both Ashton Dolan,
Okay, Genty.
And Matthew Golden.
Right.
And he has a pretty clear preference here.
So while he acknowledges that, Matthew Golden's speed is a valuable asset.
Right.
And, something that the Cowboys arguably need.
Yeah.
Especially with Brandon Cooks re-signing with New Orleans.
Sure.
He still would choose Dolan.
Mm.
And his reasoning is he's more familiar and comfortable with what has led to success in Dallas.
Right.
Specifically referencing the, triplet formation era.
Yeah.
And he just feels like, Dolan's skill set could replicate that.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting because the game has changed so much.
Right. Speed is at a premium now.
Speed is so important. So
Yeah.
it's like, is he maybe, kind of holding on to the past too much there?
Right.
Is
he not adapting with the times?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Okay, so now for what I think is maybe the curveball here.
Yeah.
His surprising thoughts on potentially drafting Shedeur Sanders.
Right.
And Stephen Jones has said that, they're interested in drafting a young quarterback at some point.
Yeah.
And so the question was posed to Irvin.
Right.
Would you take Sanders if he were available?
And his answer
Oh, yeah.
was pretty emphatic.
Oh, yeah.
He said, right now,
Wow.
no hesitation.
Okay.
And he even said that he would prioritize drafting Sanders
Over other needs.
over other needs.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's a strong belief in his talent.
Yeah, he really believes in this guy.
Yeah. And his future potential.
Wow. That came out of left field. I mean,
It really did.
even with all their current needs,
And
he would take Sanders right now.
right now,
Okay.
that's a big statement.
Yeah, and it sounds like, the allure of a talented young quarterback is so strong
Oh, yeah.
that he wouldn't even let his desire for a player like Dolan deter him.
Right. It sounds like he wants to solidify that quarterback position
Yeah.
for the future.
It's interesting because he also seems dismissive of any negative opinions that he might have heard about Sanders.
Yeah, he's not really paying attention to that.
Right.
He sees something special in him.
Interesting. And I think this really highlights this ongoing debate in the NFL
Yeah.
about balancing, those immediate needs
Right.
with long-term strategic planning,
Especially at quarterback.
especially at quarterback.
That's the most important position.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think to kind of bring it all together, Michael Irvin's, key insights here,
Right.
revolve around this core belief in offensive firepower.
Yeah.
He feels like the Cowboys still need a difference-making running back.
Okay.
Ideally, someone like Ashton Bellin,
Right.
another receiver to complement CeeDee Lamb.
Uh-huh.
He views Cooper Kupp landing in Seattle as a missed opportunity for Dallas,
Yeah.
but a good fit for Kupp.
Right.
He has a lingering concern about the connection between Lamb and the quarterback.
Yep.
And then maybe the most surprising thing is that he is very enthusiastic about the idea of drafting Shedeur Sanders.
Right. So much so that it's almost like he's not even thinking about anything else. It's like he's got tunnel vision on getting Sanders.
Yeah. So there's a definite tension in his perspective between, addressing the immediate needs on offense
Right.
to compete now,
Yeah.
and then this potential long-term investment in a quarterback,
Yeah.
like Shedeur Sanders.
You going to win now,
Right.
or you going to build for the future.
Right.
It's a tough decision.
Yeah, absolutely. So for you listening out there, taking into account Michael Irvin's analysis,
Right.
what do you think is the most critical area the Cowboys should prioritize to maximize their chances of success in the upcoming season? And, how much weight should they give to planning for the future at the quarterback position?
Right.
As Irvin so strongly suggests, with his interest in Shedeur Sanders.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right?
It really is. It's a balancing act.
It is immediate competitiveness.
Right.
Versus, potential long-term gains.
Right.
It's really tough.
Yeah, thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Always a pleasure.
What's the most pressing question you're left with?
I think it really comes down to whether a focus on those immediate offensive upgrades
Right.
is the right path.
Yeah.
Or if, securing a potential future franchise quarterback should really take precedence, even if it means waiting longer for those other pieces
Right.
to come together on offense. That's really something to think about.
Yeah, lots to think about as we look ahead to the Cowboys season.
For sure.
There.